My name is Nathaniel Carter, and I live in a small town called Salem, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. I was 34 years old when this incident happened to me. It was a late autumn evening, and I was on my way from Charleston to an even smaller town called Thurmond, a nearly abandoned relic from the coal boom days, frozen in time. I had recently taken an interest in the forgotten places of America, photographing ghost towns and derelict buildings for a side project that had grown into a consuming passion. But nothing, not even the most haunted ruins, could have prepared me for what I experienced that night. The train I boarded in Charleston was an old Amtrak line, one of the few still running through these mountains. The ride was supposed to be straightforward, a slow, scenic journey through the heart of Appalachia, arriving in Thurmond by midnight. But as soon as I settled into my seat, I felt a strange unease, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the train's worn-out windows. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers who looked as weary as the train itself. An old man with a long, gray beard sat across from me, staring out the window with vacant eyes. A young couple a few rows down whispered quietly, their voices muffled by the sound of the train's rhythmic clattering. Everything seemed normal at first, just another late-night train ride through the mountains. But then, about an hour into the journey, the train started to slow down. We were in the middle of nowhere, the only light coming from the dim bulbs inside the carriage and the faint glow of the moon outside. The train wasn't supposed to stop until Thurmond, but it slowed to a crawl, then finally came to a complete halt. The other passengers looked around, confused. The old man across from me mumbled something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. I glanced out the window, expecting to see a deer on the tracks or maybe some fallen branches. But there was nothing. Just the dark, dense forest pressing in on both sides, the trees like silent sentinels watching over us. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, but his words were lost in static, only fragments reaching us. Something about a delay and temporary issue. But it didn't sound convincing, even to him. Minutes passed, then an hour. The atmosphere inside the carriage grew tense. The young couple shifted nervously in their seats, and the old man had begun muttering more loudly, his eyes fixed on something unseen in the distance. I tried to ignore him, but his words finally broke through the haze of fear that had settled over me. It's coming. It's coming for us. Before I could ask him what he meant, the train suddenly lurched forward, not a smooth acceleration, but a violent jolt that threw me against the seat in front of me. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only sound was the screech of the wheels on the tracks, the metal groaning under some unseen pressure. The train picked up speed, faster than I thought was possible on those old, winding tracks. The moonlight filtering through the windows was our only illumination, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear the couple a few rows down, the woman's voice rising in panic. The old man's muttering had turned into a frantic chant, words tumbling out in a language I didn't recognize. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the train came to a stop. Not a gradual deceleration, but an abrupt, bone-jarring halt that knocked the wind out of me. The lights flickered back on, but the carriage was empty. The seats that had been occupied just moments before were now vacant, as if the passengers had vanished into thin air. I was alone. Heart pounding, I scrambled to my feet and rushed to the door at the end of the carriage. It was jammed. I pounded on it, shouting for anyone, conductor, passenger, anyone, to hear me. But there was no response, only the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Panicked, I looked out the window. We were no longer in the forest. The train had stopped on a bridge, high above a deep, black ravine. The trees below were barely visible in the moonlight, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. But there was something else, a shadow moving among the trees, something large and unnatural, slithering through the underbrush with a purpose. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. I had to be dreaming, caught in some nightmare I couldn't wake from. But the cold metal of the train, the rough fabric of the seat beneath my fingers, all felt too real, too solid. Suddenly, the door at the other end of the carriage creaked open. I spun around, expecting to see the conductor or another passenger. But the figure that stepped through was neither. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a long dark coat that seemed to swallow the light around it. Its face was hidden in the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. I wanted to scream, fight, to do anything to break free of the terror that had seized me, but I was paralyzed. The figure stopped a few feet from me, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without a word, it raised one hand and pointed to the door behind me. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but the message was clear. It wanted me to leave. Gathering every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead, but I stumbled to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. To my shock, it turned easily and the door swung open, revealing the next carriage. I stepped through without looking back, the cold air from outside rushing in like a slap to the face. The next carriage was empty too, but something was different. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white images of people in early 20th century clothing, their faces blurred and indistinct. They stared down at me with hollow eyes, their expressions frozen in time. I hurried through the carriage, my footsteps echoing in the silence. But as I reached the end, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the door was locked again, trapping me inside. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I was moving, the train hurtling forward once more, faster and faster, the images on the walls blurring as we sped through the night. My only thought was to get out, to find a way off this cursed train. I rushed to the next door, but before I could reach it, the lights flickered and went out again, plunging me into darkness. I felt the train lurch beneath me, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it would derail, sending me plunging into the ravine below. But instead, it slowed, the wheels screeching as it came to a grinding halt. I was thrown to the floor, the impact knocking the breath out of me. When I finally managed to stand, the lights flickered back on, revealing a door in front of me, a door that hadn't been there before. It was an old wooden door, the kind you'd find in a house, not a train. The paint was chipped and peeling, the handle rusted with age. My hand trembled as I reached for it, every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But something compelled me to open it, to step through to whatever lay beyond. The door creaked open, and I found myself standing on a platform. But this wasn't Thurmond. It wasn't anywhere I recognized. The platform was crumbling, overgrown with weeds, the tracks rusted and broken. There were no buildings, no signs of life. Just the faint outline of the mountains in the distance, shrouded in mist. I stepped out onto the platform, the cold air biting into my skin. The train was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I was alone, stranded in this forgotten place. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but there was nothing familiar, nothing to indicate where I was or how I had gotten there. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. I started walking, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape didn't change. The platform stretched on endlessly, the mountains in the distance always just out of reach. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. I couldn't tell anymore. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this place. My legs grew heavy, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I kept walking, driven by some primal need to escape, to find a way out. But there was no way out. The platform looped back on itself, an endless, nightmarish circle. I was trapped, doomed to wander this forgotten corner of the world for eternity. And then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I heard it. the faint, distant sound of a train whistle. I looked up, hope surging in my chest. But as the sound grew louder, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't a train coming to rescue me. It was the ghost train, returning to claim its next victim. I could hear it now, the unmistakable clattering of wheels on tracks, the shrill whistle cutting through the stillness like a blade. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the mountains like a death knell. Panic surged through me, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was trapped on this endless platform, a prisoner of this cursed place. The fog began to thicken, swirling around me like a living thing, obscuring my vision. The ground beneath my feet trembled as the train approached, its massive silhouette emerging from the mist. But this was no ordinary train. It was a monstrous, ancient machine, its iron body rusted and decayed, the windows dark and lifeless. The engine belched black smoke that hung in the air like a shroud, and the wheels, slick with some unholy substance, churned forward with a relentless, grinding force. The train screeched to a halt in front of me, and the door to the nearest carriage creaked open, revealing nothing but a yawning abyss of darkness inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared into the void, every instinct screaming at me to stay back, to flee. But my body wouldn't listen. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me closer to the open door. As I stood at the threshold, I could feel the cold, oppressive air seeping out from within, wrapping around me like icy fingers. The darkness inside was suffocating, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow all light. I hesitated, fighting the overwhelming urge to step inside, to give in to whatever force was compelling me forward. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from deep within the darkness. It was a voice I knew, a voice I hadn't heard in years. My sister, Caroline. She had disappeared when I was just a boy, vanished without a trace during a family trip, these very mountains. The search had gone on for weeks, but she was never found. Her disappearance had haunted me ever since, the mystery of what had happened to her gnawing at me like an open wound. The sound of her voice now, calling out to me from the depths of that cursed train, shattered any resolve I had left. I had to find her, to bring her back. I stepped into the carriage, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. The door slammed shut behind me with a final, echoing thud, sealing me inside. The carriage was unlike anything I had ever seen. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a distorted, nightmarish version of myself. My reflection's eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The floor beneath me seemed to shift and warp, the wood creaking and groaning as if the train itself was alive, a sentient being feeding off my fear. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air was thick with the stench of decay, of something rotten and ancient. The voice continued to call my name, growing louder, more insistent. But there was something wrong with it now, something off. It was no longer my sister's voice. It had taken on a mocking, sinister tone, as if whatever was calling me knew exactly how to lure me in. The mirrors along the walls began to crack and splinter, shards of glass falling to the floor with a soft, tinkling sound. The reflections twisted and contorted, their features melting into grotesque parodies of my own face. I tried to turn back, but the carriage stretched out endlessly in both directions, trapping me in this nightmarish corridor. Suddenly, the train jolted, and I was thrown against the wall. The mirrors shattered, sending glass flying in every direction. I shielded my face, but the shards cut into my skin, warm blood trickling down my cheeks. The train was moving again, faster than ever, the world outside a blur of dark shapes and shadows. I struggled to stay on my feet as the carriage rocked violently, the floor beneath me buckling and cracking, the walls closed in, the space shrinking, suffocating me. The voice was all around me now, no longer pretending to be my sister. It was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent, a presence that had lurked in the shadows of these mountains for centuries. "You're mine now," it whispered, the words slithering into my mind like poison. You'll never leave this place. You'll ride the ghost train for all eternity. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat was raw, my voice stolen by the darkness. I could feel it closing in, the presence wrapping around me like a shroud, pulling me down into the depths of the train's malevolent soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the train stopped. The door at the end of the carriage flew open, and I was flung out into the night, landing hard on the cold, damp ground. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the world spinning around me. When I finally looked up, the train was gone. The platform was gone. I was lying in the middle of a dirt road, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The air was still and cold, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. I forced myself to my feet, my body aching from the ordeal. I was no longer in that twisted, forgotten place. I was back in the real world, the nightmare over. But as I looked around, trying to get my bearings, I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. The road stretched out before me, disappearing into the darkness. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate how far I had traveled, or where I was now. The only light came from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I started walking, my legs shaky and weak. The memories of what had happened on that train were already beginning to fade, slipping away like a dream upon waking. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in my stomach that refused to go away. I walked for what felt like hours, the night dragging on interminably. Finally, just as dawn began to break on the horizon, I spotted a small, dilapidated house at the edge of the woods. Smoke curled up from the chimney, a faint sign of life in the otherwise desolate landscape. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open as I stepped onto the porch, and a figure appeared in the doorway. A woman, old and bent with age, her eyes milky and unfocused. "You've been on the train," she said, her voice cracked and ancient. "You've seen it." I nodded, unable to find the words to reply. She shook her head sadly. "Many have gone, few have returned. The ghost train takes what it wants, leaves the rest wandering. You're lucky to be alive." I wanted to ask her where I was, how to get back home, but before I could speak, she turned and shuffled back into the house, closing the door behind her. I was left standing on the porch, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. I never did find out where I was or how I got there. I wandered for days before finally stumbling upon a road that led me to civilization. But I never spoke of the ghost train again, not to anyone. The nightmares continued for years, the sound of that whistle haunting my dreams, the memory of that dark, twisted carriage forever etched in my mind. I still travel, still photograph the forgotten places of the world, but I stay far away from the mountains of West Virginia, because I know that somewhere, out there in the darkness, the ghost train still rides, searching for its next victim, waiting for the day when it will come for me once more. And next time, I might not be so lucky.